There's good and bad memories here. It wasn't 100% sadness and getting beat up all the time at school. But the bad parts is what's holding us back.
Those bad parts, those unspeakable truths, are forever engraved in Florence Sparvier's mind. The 80-year-old is a survivor of the Maryville Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan.
I learned how not to pray, but not praying to the same God that they were praying. Because the one that they were praying to, made us pray to, he was mean as hell, you know. The nuns were mean, the priests were not good to people. They kept everything under wraps.
Sparvier was separated from her family when she was just 7 years old. Her mother and grandmother also attended Maryville.
So we went willingly because if we didn't go, one of the parents had to go to jail.
A far cry from how residential schools were portrayed to Canadians at the time.
For the oldest Canadians, a new future.
Now, this dark chapter in Canadian history is coming to light. Last month, ground-penetrating radar detected an estimated 751 unmarked graves at Cowessess First Nation, the largest discovery so far, at a cemetery steps away from the Maryville site.
This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves. And it was the priest of the day that had these headstones removed. And our end goal is to make sure that we have a beautiful monument with all the names here.
Chief Cadmus Delorme, whose parents were also residential school survivors, says there were at least 139 residential schools in Canada. Some 150,000 children were taken away from their families, and thousands never came home. The schools were opened by the federal government and operated by the Roman Catholic Church.
Another sad reality is the Roman Catholic Church, when they wiped out the headstones, they maintained theirs. But you know, just like this site has been respected, we want to make sure everyone is respected here because that is our Indigenous ideology.
Lori Campbell's grandmother was taken to a residential school, but the intergenerational trauma is still being felt today.
Because of my grandmother struggling, as a parent, my mother ended up being taken away by the police at a young age as well. And then came along the 60 scoop, which was when they started shutting down the residential schools. They decided that they would take Indigenous children and adopt them into white families in order to assimilate us. And so then I was taken by the police and taken away for 16 years.
But there are signs of change. Last month, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in Cowessess to announce Canada's landmark Bill C-92. It allows the community to take back control of its child welfare system by deciding if a child should be removed from their home instead of their fate being left to the discretion of a judge or social services.
It is shameful that here in Cowessess and across the country, children died because of the policy of residential schools.
This means at-risk kids will now be cared for in the community by the community. The hope is that this will address the overpopulation of Indigenous children in foster care. Canada's 2016 census found that more than half of the children in care were Indigenous, despite only making up 7.7% of the country's child population. 165 Cowessess kids are currently in government care, spread out in neighboring provinces Manitoba and British Columbia. Trudeau has pledged $38.7 million to help Cowessess take charge of its own social services.
It helps us control our own destiny. And that is what First Nations, Indigenous people should be doing. The reason we're in this situation with residential schools, with child welfare, with high incarceration rates, is loss of control, is colonization, is genocide. And so what we did a few weeks ago is Cowessess rightfully took back something we never gave up.
This decision-making power was stripped from Canada's Indigenous communities 70 years ago.
We have more Indigenous kids in care right now than we had attend the residential schools. And so that is the legacy of the residential schools. If you're looking to destroy a people, take their children, right?
In May, the first unmarked gravesite was discovered in Kamloops, British Columbia. One survivor there says residential schools taught Indigenous children to be ashamed of their identity.
The residential schools were specifically built to take the Indian out of us, to take away our language, culture, and traditions, but it did not work.
Back in Cowessess, Sparvier reflects on the lives lost.
Residential school never taught us what our gifts are. And we were all born with gifts. And if we were nurtured right through, like, we would be okay. We would be okay.
While she's optimistic about the future, she says Canada's painful past is only just beginning to be unearthed. Adil Halim, TRT World, Cowessess First Nation.